The Tibetan Book of the Dead, translated by Gyurme Dorje and read by Angus Cargill. Chapter 11. The Great Liberation by Hearing. I take refuge from now until enlightenment in the Buddha, the sacred teachings, and the Supreme Assembly. Through the merit of practicing generosity and the other perfections, may I attain Buddhahood for the sake of all living beings. Maintaining this same visualization, the Lama should slowly recite with full concentration the four immeasurable aspirations, based on the cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. May all sentient beings be endowed with happiness. May they all be separated from suffering and its causes. May they be endowed with joy, free from suffering. May they abide in equanimity, free from attraction and aversion. Up to this point, the preliminary procedures are common to all the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. Next, the Lama should enter into the practice of the natural liberation of habitual tendencies, as presented in Chapter 5. During the practice of the initial 10-branched prayer, contained in Chapter 5, the refuge tree is still visualized in the space in front. As the 10-branched prayer is concluded, the Lama visualizes that all the objects of refuge melt into light, and then gradually dissolve into the crowns of each of the attending persons, including the dying person and himself. So at this point, the body, speech, and mind of all enlightening beings, the objects of refuge, become indivisible from the Lama's own body, speech, and mind, and those of all others present. Like water poured into water, they become inseparably one in nature. In this way, it is visualized that all those present are brought under the protection of the three precious jewels. Then, like a bubble emerging from water, the Lama visualizes himself arising out of emptiness in the form of Vajrasattva, and he continues with the practice of the natural liberation of habitual tendencies. Once this practice is complete, extensive mental offerings should then be made to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and the Lama should slowly recite 3 or 7 times the short prayer entitled An Aspirational Prayer, calling to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas for assistance, see Chapter 2, followed by the accompanying aspirational prayers. This is often followed by a series of more general recitations from the Buddhist canon, including the Sutra of the Three Heaps, Triskandaka Sutra, dedicated to the 35 Buddhas of confession, the recitation of the names of the 1,000 Buddhas of this eon, following the arrangement of Sakyasri of Kashmir, entitled Ornate Garland of the Auspicious Eon, Bhadra, Kalpika, Lamka, Ramala, together with the recitation of the mantras given in the Tantra of the purification of all lower destinies, Savadurga, Tipari, Sodana, Tantra. Just to hear these names is said to make a powerful impact on the consciousness of the dying person. At this point, the Lama has to be very observant of the dying person. Excessive preoccupation with the completion of these recitations may distract him from seizing the moment when the dying person's consciousness actually leaves the body. Carefully observing the signs of death, as indicated in the natural liberation through recognition of the visual indications and signs of death, Chapter 8, just before the person passes away, the Lama should immediately begin the introduction to the intermediate state of the time of death, the first part of the present chapter, even if the previous recitations are unfinished. In certain circumstances, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation might be given, in accordance with the cycle entitled 8 Transmitted Precepts, Oral Transmission of the Awareness Holder, which was revealed by the 5th Dalai Lama, or an equivalent text. This may maintain life for a short period, while final guidance is given. Accordingly, the dying one should be guided through the processes of the dissolution of the elements, as set out in Chapter 8, before continuing with the introduction to the intermediate state of the time of death, as set out in this chapter. Usually, the dying person is addressed by name, or by the expression, child of Buddha nature. One who is worthy of great respect is addressed by an expression such as Venerable One, Spiritual Master, Teacher, or Your Ladyship, and so forth. If it is someone from whom the attending Lama has personally received teaching, he may use the expression Lord of the Refuge, or Great Lama, and so forth. There are different modes of address. The voice of the Lama who calls out to the dying person should be very melodious, so that merely upon hearing the sound of the instructions, the person feels soothed, elevated, and attracted. Following the outer dissolution of the four elements and the inner dissolution of the processes of conceptual thought into redness, whiteness, and blackness, the Lama should recite the verses describing the moment of the arising of the inner radiance of the ground. These words of introduction should be read aloud 3 times. If the dying person fails to recognize the first inner radiance and swoons into unconsciousness, the Lama should proceed with the introduction to the second inner radiance, followed by the introduction to the emergence of the peaceful and wrathful deities during the intermediate state of reality. Once the introduction to the intermediate state of reality has been completed, the attending Lama should closely observe the body of the deceased and seek to determine whether he or she has attained liberation from rebirth in cyclic existence. If emancipation has occurred, the body will take on a certain glow, and while being in its presence, one will experience a sensation of happiness. The body will not smell. It will look just like a living person who is sleeping. These are signs that the consciousness of the deceased has attained liberation. In addition, external environmental signs may arise, as described in Chapter 8, including distinctive cloud formations and rainbows. If the deceased is a realized yogin, monk, or layperson who has gained complete freedom at the time of death, then the attending Lama may hear the sound of chanting and the music of sacred instruments, such as the skull drum or bell. On the other hand, if the consciousness of the deceased has not been emancipated, the complexion of the deceased will become disquieting and may inspire a sense of fear when it is seen. The face will become grey and dusty, and the body will begin to decompose very quickly. If the consciousness of the deceased does not attain liberation while in the intermediate state of reality, the mental body assumed by the deceased will then immediately fall into the intermediate state of rebirth, at which time the attending Lama should recite the introduction to that phase, as presented in the latter part of this chapter. Importantly, these introductions to the 3 intermediate states of the time of death, reality, and rebirth should be supplemented, if appropriate, by the practice of the transference of consciousness, as presented in Chapter 10. If the internal and external signs are very good, consciousness transference will not be necessary, and could even be potentially harmful. The attending Lama must take great care as to if and when consciousness transference should be practiced. It is not only highly realized spiritual masters who remain in meditation during these intermediate states, but even ordinary men, women, and children may have achieved a settled state of mind, enabling them to remain in peaceful and deep meditation after death. If consciousness transference were performed in such cases, the deceased would be disturbed. Moreover, since the consciousness of the deceased has a tendency to leave the body from whichever point it is touched, the relatives, loved ones, and the attending lama should refrain from touching the body, or only tap the crown fontanelle in order to induce the consciousness to leave from that point. If the attending lama decides that consciousness transference is the appropriate course of action, it should be repeated many times until certain indications occur, such as the emergence of mucus or blood from both nostrils. Further, in order to induce the consciousness to leave the body via the crown, which is the optimum gateway for the transference to take effect, the means of preventing the consciousness from leaving through other orifices, as described in Chapter 10, should be applied. This is facilitated by visualizing that the 9 orifices of the body are each sealed by a single hum syllable, thus forcing the consciousness to exit via the crown fontanelle. In any event, if the attending lama feels that the consciousness of the deceased has become confused and trapped, or if the corpse begins to decompose and lose its radiance, then consciousness transference should be immediately performed. Once the introductions to the intermediate states of the time of death, reality, and rebirth have been concluded, the attending lama should then recite the prayer for union with the spiritual teacher, Chapter 2, the natural liberation of habitual tendencies, Chapter 5, the 100-fold homage, Chapter 6, the confession, Chapter 7, and the liberation by wearing, Chapter 14. At this juncture, the attending lama may read certain general prayers not included within the present cycle, such as the aspirational prayer for good conduct, Bodhisattva Pranida Naraja, one of the many versions of the aspirational prayer for rebirth in Sukhavati, the aspirational prayer of Maitreya Pranidhana, and the final chapter of the introduction to the conduct of a bodhisattva, Bodhisattva Charyavatara, which concerns the dedication of merit on behalf of all sentient beings. These may be followed by a further recitation of prayers specific to the present cycle, namely the root verses of the 6 intermediate states, Chapter 3, and the aspirational prayers, Chapter 12. This completes the summary of the process through which the attending lama tends directly to the consciousness of the dying person and the deceased. Part 1. An elucidation of the intermediate state of the time of death and of the appearance of the peaceful deities in the intermediate state of reality. Herein is contained the great liberation by hearing, an elucidation of the intermediate state of reality, which is an extract from the Peaceful and Wrathful Deities, a profound sacred teaching entitled Natural Liberation Through Recognition of Enlightened Intention.